So let's start working on our actual leaderboard, because then we're going to be starting to draw stuff, and we'll start to see how that works, and we'll start to see how to wire up our UI with our backend. So remember, what we want is this leaderboard of Twitter users and the number of times they've tweeted. And so this is where we do this bit here. So this says leaderboard MVC. So this is the bit which is obviously going to listen to this service via WebSockets. It's going to listen to the Twitter handles that come in, and then it's going to, through JavaFX Magic, redraw or draw the UI and keep it updated with new values that come in. So what I've done is I have created a class which is going to represent the data for the leaderboard. So I kind of wanted to provide this model, view, controller separation. So the leaderboard data is going to be my model. This is all the data that's going to be shown on the screen. We will look at this in more detail in a second. But what's the interesting bit is how to wire up that data class to start listening to the user service that we have running in the background. Yes?
Does it use event handling similar to Swing?
Yes. It uses it.
You register action listeners and they fire?
You can, but it uses properties, which we'll look at. If you want to, we'll look at that in more detail. It's a much simpler model from a developer point of view. So what we want to do is we will come into WebSockets later, don't worry, but what we want is we need to set up a WebSocket client which is going to listen to the server of our user service sitting in the back end, okay? So I've created a helper class which we can look at in more detail called a client endpoint. What I want to do is I need to give it the URI to connect to, okay? So we said we wanted to run our user service at /users. Obviously, I'm running it at localhost, and I said it was port 8083. Okay, so all I'm doing is I'm creating a WebSocket client endpoint, which is going to connect to that URI. Yeah.
What is IntelliJ doing? How does it?
Oh, that was a cheat. Sorry, that was a massive cheat. I will try and point out the difference between IntelliJ's native intelligence and the massive cheats that I've put in. So I have a live template called DURIU, which is dashboard URI users, because if I mistype the URI, then we'll get it wrong. So what we've got is, and I can show you this, we have live templates, which you can create. It has a bunch of built-in live templates, but you can create live templates, and I've created a bunch known as Java 8 cheats. And what I have here is URIU. This cheat is just the string of the URI to connect to. So I lean quite heavily on live templates in this to make sure that I don't mistype some stuff. So yeah, that was IntelliJ being clever, but only because I told it how to be. So this is my user endpoint, user client. So what I want to do is, so yeah, I'm connecting to this user's URI. And what I want to do is, so we were talking a little bit about listeners and things before. This client endpoint is a class that I have created. And what you can do is you can register listeners. So we can look at that in a bit more detail later. But what I'm doing is I'm going to register a listener which is going to listen to every new Twitter handle that comes off that WebSocket and does something with it. Yes?
So that client endpoint, is that a class, or is that an object from the class?
This is, right, so the client, user client is an instance of client endpoint. Okay. And client endpoint is a class that I've created to help me, which you can have a look at in more detail if you want to, but it's not really that interesting. What the important point here is that I can add a listener, and what I want to do is I want to add my leaderboard data as a listener to this. Now, listeners need to implement message listener, so that means I need to make my leaderboard data class a message listener. I'll just tell IntelliJ to do that. So my leaderboard data now implements this message listener, which means it needs to implement this on message method. Okay, so this is fairly simple. This is not Java 8 stuff. This is just simple. I'm implementing an interface, therefore I need to provide the implementation of the methods on that interface. Okay? This is the interesting business logic of our Twitter leaderboard. So what we need to know about this is this message is the Twitter handle. We're listening to the user service, and the user service is emitting a string, which is the Twitter handle. Okay? So every time we get a new Twitter handle, we call this message, just a single Twitter handle. So you say, in your onMessage method, you say, what do I want to do with this Twitter handle when I get it? Okay? Now, what I want to do is I want to keep a record of all the Twitter handles I've ever seen. This is going to get very big in memory, so in real life, you want to make sure that you trim this and make sure it doesn't grow to an infinite size. But theoretically, I want to keep track of every Twitter handle I've ever seen. When I see the Twitter handle, I want to increment the count of the number of times I've seen it. So if I haven't seen it before, I need to record it somewhere. And if I have seen it before, I need to get that Twitter handle and increment the count of the number of times I've seen it. Okay? So this is kind of fairly simple stuff that just requires a hash map. So, well, it's going to get to be a very big hash map, but I'm going to put the Twitter handle in the hash map and a count associated with it. So I have a hash map, all Twitter users. This is a map of, I could have had a string to count, but what I wanted to do is be all domain-driven designy, so I actually have a Twitter user object that I can do stuff with. In actual fact, this Twitter user object is used in the JavaFX UI. So we will come to that in a bit more detail. But basically, we're mapping our Twitter handle to a real Twitter user. Okay? So that's not rocket science. That's fairly straightforward. So what we want to do is this message. Let's rename this so we know what it is. This is a Twitter handle. So what we want to do is we're going to find out whether our Twitter handle has been seen before or not. Okay? In the olden days, or probably in the current state, if you're not using Java 8, what you want to do is you want to say probably something like all Twitter users.get Twitter handle. So we call this Twitter user. And then if Twitter user is null, that's not the right combination. Then we say all Twitter users dot put Twitter handle, new Twitter user with a Twitter handle, because that's what Twitter user takes to create a new one. Okay, so that's kind of, we've all written code like this, right? Is it there? If it's not there, put it in there. And then we want to do something with it, like increment the count on the Twitter user. With Java 8, there's a much, much simpler way of doing this. Java 8 has, so we'll go back to our hash map, all Twitter users. It has a method called computeIfAbsent. Okay? So we're going to give it the key, which was the Twitter handle. And we give it something which looks super confusing called a mapping function. So I'm just going to say, OK, I guess what I need is I need to provide it with a function that looks like this. But what this function does is, if this Twitter handle doesn't exist in the map, call this function. Do something with this function. The output of the function, which is going to be the Twitter user, I'll put that in the map if it was absent. Okay? So I'll step through this a few times so it should become fairly clear. So again, we're using anonymous inner classes. So I have a function which takes a string, and that's going to be the parameter, the input to the function. It's also a Twitter user, which is the return type. So I'm going to take a string, which is going to be Twitter handle, and I'm going to return a Twitter user.
Again, was this IntelliJ doing something? How did it pick string and not? I mean, because that's an excellent question. How did it pick string? Oh, it picked string because the map. The map is a string to Twitter user. So the function is string to Twitter user. It has nothing to do with construction of the value type, right? Why do you? The fact that the map is a string to Twitter user, why does that have anything to do with construction? I mean, a Twitter user could have been constructed from 2 ints.
No. So the function you have to provide to compute if absent is a function that has to provide the 2 types, which are the same 2 types as that map. So the map of Twitter users is string and Twitter user. So the function that you have to provide to compute if absent is string and Twitter user. because this is the key and this is the value. It's the same type for key and value as it is on the map. That's like Java 8 is doing some really interesting type inference on this stuff.
No, so obviously the first parameter I understand has to be the string because that's the key that it's computing if absent.
Yeah.
But let's say Twitter user is nothing to do with the string.
It's nothing. It isn't anything to do with.
Let's
the
say
string.
Twitter user's constructor takes 2 ints.
Yes. It's got nothing to don't think about the constructor of Twitter user. This, we haven't even implemented this bit yet. But this is, you need to be able to somehow provide something which, given a string, which is the key to the map, will somehow give you the value of the map, the Twitter user.
Given the key, it will instantiate a value, and somehow the key is relevant to instantiating the value?
It doesn't have to be. You can instantiate the value from, we happen to be using Twitter handle, but let's say you've got a map of, I don't know, like IDs to some string username. Then maybe you need to get that from, I don't know, maybe you need to get that from somewhere else. But it's nothing to do with the construction of Twitter user. It's just about the fact that given the key value of that map, you need to give it the value of the map.
Yeah, I'm just curious, why did it need to take that at all?
Because what you're doing is, if you can't find me one of these values, create that value. And it has to find that value using the string type, using the key type, and it has to return you the value so it can put it in the map.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, so why is not just function? It's a factory for Twitter user, right?
This is, in this particular case, it's a factory for Twitter user, but it could be getting this value. Yeah, that's just the signature of compute if absent. So that's not any magic that I've done. That's just part of the Java 8 signature. But in this case, I think what you're implying, what you're getting at is, we happen to be very lucky in that a new Twitter user happens to take the Twitter handle in the constructor. Now, you're right, because we could end up needing to take in, I don't know, their age and their social security number and their whatever. So you'll need to figure out a way to get the correct values to create that Twitter user. In our particular case, we're pretty lucky because we just create that from that. And our Twitter user is only the handle and the number of times it's been seen. So the number of times it's been seen when you first create it is 0. So I don't need to pass that in. I know it's going to be 0. So let's just rename this to something useful. Okay, so what I'm doing is I provide this compute if absent method a function to call if that Twitter user happens to not be in the map. So I'm going to call this function, and this function is create me the new Twitter user with this handle. Like I say, we got lucky because we only need the Twitter handle to create our user. Once again, obviously, I've done this in like the long-handed anonymous in a class format. So we could convert this to a lambda. And this is it strips away a lot of the boilerplate. So it's much easier, but I found lambdas a little bit difficult to just automatically parse it in my head because it's new syntax for us. So the simpler format of this is if the map doesn't contain anything with this key, call this, give it the key, the handle, and create a new Twitter user and put that in the map. And that turns out to be even simpler, which IntelliJ is telling us. It tells us this can be replaced with something called a method reference. And then all we need to do is just call new on Twitter user. Now, I found this really weird to get my head around to begin with, because where did all my types go? Where did that Twitter handle go? How does it know to create that? But because you pass in a single parameter, which is the string Twitter handle, and this method takes a single parameter, which is the string handle. So Java 8 can basically go, well, that's fine. If you tell me that I just want you to call the constructor of Twitter user, I'm going to assume that what you want to do is pass in that value. I don't know. I don't really have the words for it. I find it like I wouldn't automatically write this. When I'm calling compute if absent, I wouldn't write Twitter handle, comma, Twitter user, : new. That's just not going to sit in my head. But what I might do is I might say, OK, let me think about it. Given a Twitter handle, I need to return a Twitter user. So this is what I want to do. Now simplify that. And I can simplify that straight down to a method reference. OK? I'm seeing nods, but I'm also seeing a little bit of, OK. We will see more method references throughout this. I think for me, I found method references the most difficult thing to get my head around because all of the types disappear and everything just goes away. And you're not really sure what's going on. Yes?
So can I ask you, if you can just toggle back to the previous version of this where it was handle, like...
The Lambda version?
Yeah, that.
Hold on. I can in a minute. That version.
What here was telling the method that the handle is actually Twitter handle, that instance.
So the question is, how do I know that this, which the IDE would actually like to call S, how do I know that S represents the Twitter handle? Is that your question?
How do I know that S represents that Twitter handle instance?
This Twitter handle here. Because in the... Yeah, that's a really good question.
Like, does compute absent somehow imply that the second parameter is the same as the...
That's a very good question. I find probably one of the most difficult things, apart from method references, to get your head around is where did the parameter that comes into the Lambda, where did that come from? What is that? I guess, actually, you can probably look inside the code here, right? So my mapping function, I apply key. Yeah, so that's where it says it. This is the key. This is the first parameter, Twitter handle. And it gets passed into mapping function. So it will always be that first parameter is the thing that gets passed into the mapping function. OK? Convention, I guess. Well, convention and looking at the code. So, yeah, so let's go back to our freaky method reference, which is nice and short. I don't know how descriptive that is. I don't know if it's going to get easier to read as we get more used to reading method references. I think there's definitely going to be decisions that you're going to take in your code base of, should I use a Lambda, should I use a method reference, which one is more readable in this particular case? And we're going to see a bunch of those things when we look at how to iterate over things later on. So, are we all sort of fairly clear on what this one line of code does? We've sort of shrank those 5 lines of code of, if look it up from the hash map, if it's not there, create a new one, put it in the hash map. Right, now I have a Twitter user, which I need to pull out. And this is my Twitter user. OK? And this is either a Twitter user that existed and it's in the map, or it's a Twitter user which is a brand new one that I just created. So we have a Twitter user. And then, of course, what we want to do is, quite simply, we want to increment the number of times we've seen it, because that's the whole point, right? We've just seen this new Twitter user. Let's increment the number of times we've seen it. Great, fantastic. Now what? What I want to do, what I ultimately want, is a leaderboard list of the top X many tweeters sorted in descending order of the number of times they've tweeted. OK? So this is where streams is going to come in.